A few weeks ago, I got an opportunity to participate in an interesting political process, and as part of that, I had to answer a question whether it makes sense for government to directly fund housing construction. Now, in my case, that specifically meant Canadian federal government, but the same question also applies to any of the Canadian provinces that are experiencing a housing crisis, like Ontario or British Columbia. So why don't we take a look at the evidence together and see what the answer could be? First, what exactly is the problem? This is the estimate of housing units required to comfortably house all Canadians, according to a pair of recent reports from the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is a non-partisan number-crunching arm of the Canadian Parliament. By the way, this projection already includes the recent cuts to immigration. This dip here, for example, is because of the expected decline in temporary residents. And this is the projection of housing units available. And right away, you can probably spot the problem. Right now, there is a shortage of about 1.2 million housing units. And although this is expected to shrink by almost half by 2030, you may notice that these lines are almost parallel. In fact, they don't intersect until about 2052. So the housing crisis is not going away anytime soon. So what will it take to catch up a bit sooner, by, let's say, 2032? To see that, let's take a look at the number of housing units added every year. Last year, it was about 242,000, and in the next few years, the Parliamentary Budget Office expects this number to increase to about 280,000 per year. Now, I have reasons to be skeptical of that number, and I will explain why in a few minutes, but for now, let's just take the numbers as they are. Okay, so to catch up by 2032, I did a bit of math on the data that we've seen so far, and this 280,000 would need to go up further to 355,000, an increase of additional 75,000 units per year. And looking at the chart, you can tell that this is not a small increase. It's almost 50% more than the previous record high construction level. Okay, so we do have a problem, and it will take quite a bit to fix it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the government should start throwing money at it. In order for that to make sense, there must be something here that can be specifically fixed by the additional funding. And there must be nothing that is placing a fundamental limit on how much housing can be built in Canada. Because if there is, then the new funding will compete for the same limited resources as everyone else, and that will just drive up the construction prices without producing any additional housing. So to decide what makes sense to do here, let's take a look at the forces holding back the housing supply. Specifically, let's take a look at the problems with the investment into new housing construction, municipal zoning regulations and slow approval processes, worker shortage in skilled construction trades, and a few others. Let's start with the construction spending, because that one actually presents a potential argument in favor of additional funding. Because when we take a look at the chart of investment into new housing construction, we start to see another problem. It has peaked in 2021 and has been falling since then. Now, construction investment is what results in new housing units. So if it's falling, then in the near future there will likely be a decline of housing unit completions, which is why I was skeptical of that Parliamentary Budget Office projection a few minutes ago. So why is this decline happening? The answer is interest rates. Or really, it's because the home builders fund new construction by taking out a loan from a bank, which they can only get if they can lock in a certain number of pre-construction sales. And housing sales depend heavily on interest rates, since most of the sales are ultimately paid by mortgages. So when the interest rates go up, housing sales go down, and construction projects get cancelled. And that's exactly what we see on this chart. In 2019, the Bank of Canada overnight rate was fairly low, the mortgages were cheap, and the sales were going well. When COVID hit, Bank of Canada lowered its interest rate to near zero, which led to housing sale boom and record high construction investment. Then inflation came, and by 2023, Bank of Canada raised its interest rate to a level not seen in over 20 years. Housing sales plummeted, and home builders started cancelling projects. Since then, Bank of Canada has been lowering its interest rate, but it's not projected to go back to its pre-COVID lows, and so the new housing investment is not expected to go back to record highs either. But just to meet the Parliamentary Budget Office construction projections, the ones that still come 600,000 units short of what we need, the housing investment does, in fact, have to go up to new record highs. And if we want to really solve the housing crisis by 2032, it needs to go up even higher than that, which creates a gap of $50 to $60 billion per year that somehow needs to be filled. And it's at this point, when I was looking at these numbers, that I started thinking that maybe, actually, there is an argument to be made here for government funding housing construction. And, by the way, this doesn't have to mean government giving away taxpayer money. There are ways to do this profitably for the taxpayer. Like, for example, government could fund construction of new rentals and rent them out at market rates. Or it could issue low-interest loans for construction, or something else. But let's not jump to conclusions just yet, because, again, there may be something that is placing a fundamental limit on how much housing can be built in Canada in a year. So next, let's take a look at the municipal zoning regulations and slow approval processes to see if that can be one of those limits. Here, it's already been quite well documented how the existing zoning restrictions prevent cities from building new housing in most areas. And where it is possible to build, how slow approval processes and approval delays get in the way of construction. In the worst example of this, in some cities in the Greater Toronto Area, in 2022, application approvals took, on average, almost 3 years. That said, in the last few years, the cities and the provinces have recognized that this is a major problem, and now there is a big push to fix this. There have been zoning reforms in British Columbia and Ontario, and many cities and provinces have been working to speed up approval times for new buildings. And looking again at this table of approval times in Greater Toronto, for example, we see that there is indeed a noticeable trend towards improvement among most municipalities, including Toronto itself. And remember that back in 2021, before many of these improvements, housing starts and housing completions were already reaching new highs. So it looks like municipal regulations are not so much a hard limit on how much can be built in Canada, but more of a source of additional friction and costs. They're already getting better, we just need to keep pushing to make sure that they keep getting better. Okay, so if this is not a hard limit on construction, what about worker shortages? Here we run into a bigger problem. According to BuildForce Canada, a construction industry organization that tracks labor statistics, by 2033 over 100,000 workers in various construction trades will retire. And although some will be replaced by new workers, BuildForce still expects a shortfall of over 40,000 workers. And this is based on the original scenario of low housing investment that we discussed a few minutes ago. And in fact, right now, again according to BuildForce Canada, we already have critical shortages in a number of construction skill sets in the cities with the highest demand for housing, like Toronto and Vancouver. I played around with the BuildForce projections, and going back to this chart, to hit this level of construction, somehow we'd need to find additional 30,000 workers with various construction skill sets. The good news is that on the scale of years, governments already have tools to help fix this shortage in skilled trades. Provincial governments, for example, could lean more into skilled trades education, while on the federal level, there is already an express entry program for skilled trades workers, including for many of the trades where we expect to have shortages. And it would be fairly straightforward to rebalance the immigration program to bring in more skilled trades and less of some of the other professions. And given that going forward, Canada will likely be getting up to 250,000 new permanent residents through the various skilled economic immigration programs, over the next 5 years, getting extra 200,000 to 300,000 skilled construction workers in various trades is ambitious, but looks plausible. And remember, almost every one of them will be contributing towards reducing the housing shortage rather than adding to it. So in other words, the worker shortage, even though it is a hard limit right now, looking 2 to 5 years ahead, it is actually pretty manageable. And similar, when we take a look at other forces holding back the housing supply, like falling labor productivity in construction, rising raw materials costs, rising development charges, they look, again, less like hard limits and more like risks that need to be managed. Okay, so, when we put it all together, there is a shortfall of private investment into housing, relative to what we need, and some or even most of that gap can be filled by government funding, as long as we keep pushing for improvements in municipal regulations, expand the immigration of skilled trades workers, and put together a good execution plan that accounts for other risks. Which is why my decision was that, yes, it does make sense for government to directly fund housing construction, And in fact, it may be necessary to get us out of the housing crisis in a reasonable amount of time. And that brings me back to the political process that I got to participate in that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, which was the founding convention for the Canadian Future Party, Canada's newest political party at the federal level. If you haven't heard of it yet, the Canadian Future Party is a centrist pragmatic party that is comfortable taking policies from the political left, right, or anywhere else as long as there's evidence to back them up. At the founding convention, we have approved a number of policies for the party, including funding for housing construction. And if you want to learn more about the party, check out this interview with the party's then interim leader, now actual leader, Dominic Carty. And if you want to help build a better Canada, go to the party's website and join the party, or join the mailing list. Right now there is a lot of work to do and there aren't enough people to do it.